So this will be a shorter section, and I just put this in as a thinking of some of the problems with academic industry collaborations, research, and general getting along. Okay, so academics and industry. They're very, very different vocabularies. They're often different philosophies. But amazingly, I have found, and I mean this as nice as I can say it, that both sides think they can do the other job equally well. There's a reason that people are excellent in the pharmaceutical industry, and there are reasons that people are excellent within the academic industry. And it's not because they do each other's job. It's because they are excellent at what they do. And I'm a big believer that people that are excellent at what they do, expanding that, bringing that together, and making now the best total team that you possibly can. There's a big difference in promises and reality, and there's a big difference in expectations. So, what does that mean? Okay, so there's a prevailing view that academic or basic research is sort of an early funnel into the drug discovery machine. That the industrial drug discovery, there's this overlap, and it's how well they can, adopt and pick up the ideas and propel them into new medicines. So the belief is that by enhancing the overlap here, that you would really be able to bring better therapies to market. It seems simple. A prevailing view from the industry side is that academic research is focused on validating targets for the pharmaceutical industry. I don't really know exactly how this belief came to be, but it's actually completely prevalent. That you identify targets and publish and get grants, validate targets and publish and develop tool models and in vivo studies with grants. And I don't think they realize just how little money there is in grants. But that's a view. And so the pharmaceutical industry has actually spent millions, huge groups, on figuring out ways to collaborate and tap into this overlap. Pfizer completely started a whole new group in 5 cities now just to do this. I got bad news for him. Okay. He's actually a friend of mine, but it's okay. I think I've told him this once or twice. So is this the reality? So here's one of them. That there's a partnership between Pfizer and HMS. But if you look at if you just read the 2 statements that each one of them puts on their website, you identify something strikingly misaligned. And it is not that people don't want these collaborations to exist. It is not that everyone doesn't desperately want to find a better model to engage. Everyone is willing to give a little. But there really is a natural misalignment of goals, and there really is a misalignment in sort of equity in funding. So how can you better understand the issues? Okay, so look, I was a grad student, I was a postdoc. I actually sat on 3 SABs when I was a postdoc. But my goal was to actually make myself a better scientist. All right? Training scientists, feeding the industry with the best knowledge and understanding of how to tackle difficult and hopefully bigger and harder problems, that is no small feat. Right? That is a huge problem in times of difficult funding. And so expecting, I mean, this is basically saying we are creating the next generation of scientists. That is phenomenal. And they'll take those learnings and apply them in a way that will make all kinds of things better for mankind. But the view is, if you're supposed to sort of generate and test hypotheses to validate targets, and if that's a view from the industry side, which again is very prevalent, that's very different. Because the reality is the cost of some of these studies to actually validate something, to say someone's going to invest in a drug discovery project, is very different. So an example, there was a program there was a group that I had a group leading, and they were combining, it was a combination drug. One drug was already marketed. They wanted to combine something else with it to make the side effects less, and they wanted to understand if that was going to be good, bad, or indifferent. And so there was a paper. There was a collaboration with a leading academic investigator who did an actually great rodent study. Had N of 12 per group, had 4 groups, dose response over time. It was great. So we had to know whether we were going to go run a clinical study on this. So clinical statisticians looked at it. And they said, well, actually, to prove this, you need a slightly bigger study to prove this hypothesis or not. That 12 is just not quite enough. We ended up publishing the paper. It had 1,200 mice in it, because that was the only way to statistically prove that you were not going to have an effect in the study. That study, I have no idea how much it cost me. It was that big. You can't expect people who are focused on one thing to really take on these large studies, because it's not important. It's not the purpose. Also, the language is different, right? What a company needs to start a program is very different, I think, than many people might recognize of what's needed. You think sound science, good studies, a couple papers, let's go start a program. There's a lot more that's needed than that. But whose job is that to do that? So what I'd say is that the goal of academic research is not actually to be a true funnel, if you will, into the industry pipeline. It's just not the right thing to expect. Okay, so what about the other side? Well, as we just talked about, internal R&D is shrinking. Okay, so the bar for initiating a new program is much, much higher. We talked about the failures and faces. This is a great quote. I won't say who it was, from Peter Kim. Why invest? I wrote it down in my notebook. Why invest in this next new shiny thing that will fail too? Well, dude, that kills you. You know. And then every company is really striving for competitive edge since there's fewer programs. So the ability to share on some things is actually shrinking. It's growing on some, but it's shrinking on others. So it's actually more like this. And what this raises is not how do we maximize the overlap. It's perhaps more, how do you fill the gap? How do you take the fantastic science here and the true and real hurdles and the financial constraints that exist here and bridge this gap? If you think about the problem this way, it's one solution. But if you think about the problem this way, it's a completely different solution. So a new view is we really need to develop collaboration models that fill this gap. That's my pretext. That's what I've seen. This doesn't help. This was a study that was published that basically said, I don't know, I've heard it interpreted many, many ways, academic research is not reproducible. Well, there's a lot of undertone that goes with that. Some people present it as a way of, we don't trust anything. Some people say, well, it's just people making up data to get papers published because they need grants. Look, That may happen, any industry that's as big as our academic research industry, but the reality is that the papers that are generated and peer-reviewed are there. They're generated for the best reasons. The studies are done in the best way that they were conducted to execute them, and the data is what the data is. And they're accepted and they're published. What's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that, unless you view that paper as your target validation for your drug discovery projects. Because now you're saying, well, when we go to reproduce this phenomenal RNAi data, and it was followed up by a tool compound in cells, but now we take it into our internal industry cell lines of primary cells and test it in these 3 mouse models, it doesn't work anymore. Therefore, the original finding was wrong. Well, no. The original finding was the original finding in the way that it was done. And I'm sure they weren't sitting around thinking wow, can't wait to feed Pfizer's pipeline now. It was research. So conversations like this just actually make the gap bigger, and they don't help with the overlap. So what do we do about this? So you have 2 sides, oftentimes slightly frustrated at one another. There's actually a gap when maybe they view there's an overlap, and maybe there's not full lack of trust amongst them. But yet, the world's best science is often coming out of here that these guys could greatly benefit from. The funding situation. There is no way that this amount of funding on pharmaceutically related research is anywhere near enough to truly help the overlap. There's just not enough money from NIH coming into labs that can be used to drive targets all the way into industry. It's just so not fair to expect that. Before I get to neglected disease. So, actually, I will get into that. I'll do it here. So there's this gap. It exists. And we have to fix it. Now, I will say that the reason that the pharmaceutical industry has decided to invest as much as they have in this overlap, it's actually really simple. A little under half of the drugs that the pharmaceutical industry ultimately makes originated in biotech. Okay, so they had to license it and therefore pay someone else some milestones and royalty, which are fine. They don't mind necessarily paying for success. But a little under half of the drugs came from biotech originally. And biotech, on a whole, is funded by venture capital. And venture capital and funding of biotechs, on a whole, what they do is they find academic investigators that can start new companies. So from the pharmaceutical industry, they're paying an industry, which really, venture capital is, on the whole scheme of things, is not that much money. They see that, hold on, we have more money to spend than the 3 largest venture capital firms together. Why are we paying a middleman, in essence? Why are we paying the venture capital groups to take these ideas, start them, and then feed our pipeline eventually? Now, I'd say that was the mindset of 4 of the largest pharmas that took on this effort of bridging, of maximizing this overlap. But it's a little bit of a flawed concept, because the venture capital money, most of those projects don't work. And what they actually are doing is they're trying to extend that arrow a little bit to the right. So that's what that money is doing. And so you can't maximize the overlap by doing something when in reality the system currently is about extending it a little further to the right. Also, that is why what they don't realize is that what actually happens to academic investigators when venture capital funds a project and it goes in and it gets recapped 3 times, basically the academic investigator ends up with nothing. And actually the first investors end up with very little. It's actually the last investor that ends up with all the money. And so it's actually a pretty cruddy system if you're an academic investigator as well. But maybe that's a topic for a later talk. So neglected diseases. So take our previous thoughts that we had, and now you overlay that the profit motive just went down. So how do you have a pharmaceutical industry take on neglected diseases when there's almost no profit to be made? Well, it's important because about 1/6 of the world's population is affected by neglected diseases. Most of the people that are affected are mothers and children, and if you're a compassionate human being, you can sort of see that that's something we should do something about. And you would have a positive impact everywhere beyond exactly who you're treating. So they're not going to be generating profit. These diseases are diseases. They're varied and unique. They're hard problems. So it's not like they're just easy chip shots that you're just going to take out. NIH funding on neglected diseases is really low. And so philanthropy has to play a key role here. I'll skip that. That's just to show how abysmal the funding is. So in neglected diseases, how can we think about this problem? So we have a gap. We have funding, a funding issue. We have no way to progress it. So in academic research, most of it's around understanding the disease, what to treat, but there's really limited research due to funding on therapeutic intervention. There's no profit motive in pharma, so they need a rapid, quick, and easy progression to make this financially less risky. Just want to put this out, the Gates model. So people are like, oh, the Gates Foundation is going to take care of this. The Gates Foundation is really about progressing later stage molecules into the clinic. This is a really laudable cause. This is fantastic because some of that early development cost of those phase 1s can be absorbed by this group. The problem is the earliest stages are completely ignored. So the new discoveries, how do you actually get them done? So the disconnect that we have is around most academic institutions don't have access to true drug discovery expertise and capabilities. And the pharma industry is really lacking the motivation to contribute that to academic environments. So why is that, and how do we do this? Well, look, there's only one way of doing this. And the only way of doing this is, as we spoke about earlier, you have experts, you bring them together, and you share. Okay. I have 3 boys. I try to teach this every day. It's hard with them. It's even harder once you get past 30. So, but this is really all it is. Academic institutions, we tend to overvalue our discoveries. Pharma tends to be way overprotective of their perceived assets. This combination won't work for neglected diseases. We need to basically share and enable early discovery, early findings in this space. And it has to be done in a collaborative way. So there has to be open-minded and close collaboration between pharma and academics. Go back to the beginning. This is hard. It's a different vocabulary. It's different expectations. How do you do this? This is not going to happen overnight. So I'm going to skip this one due to time, but basically there's certain things we do in academics, there's certain things done in the pharmaceutical industry, and there's certain things that lie in the gap. Both groups have the capabilities, they have the potential to have the capacity, but they have to both contribute to that gap. There's a question, I think, earlier. So why doesn't pharma just do this? Well, I mean, they could go do it if they wanted to, right? I mean, you can go take out TB. No, they can't. When you're a for-profit organization, there's only a limit to so many things that you can do that you're allowed because you're owned by a board that's there to make dividends on stock. The pharmaceutical industry is not actually part of the healthcare sector. So they can't just give away money. They're just not allowed to. The CEO would get fired. There's certain things that they can take on with board approval, and I think groups like GSK have done that. But there's certain things that they just can't do, and this is one. You can't intentionally lose money. So it's really going to take all three of these groups coming together to make this work. Now, if anyone's ever seen a talk in industry, if you throw up a Venn diagram with 3 circles with an overlap, you are guaranteed success. Okay? So just want to leave it at that. So focus on what each part does well. There's no reason for academic labs to be doing lead optimization or safety studies. It's just not going to, there's no reason for that. Don't have pharma really take on the basic biology and mechanistic. And don't ask philanthropic groups to oversee the process of drug discovery. Okay? Let everyone do what they do well, make it a team, and it should succeed. The problem is it takes this. And that is hard to build. It's people, it's time, it's perceptions. So academics, they have to work together. You have to bring all the groups together to actually do this. It can't just be one lab. It's all the people in the field. We all can understand how difficult that can be. Pharma, they have to get out of their own way. I don't know how many times I've seen, well, we could let them screen those compounds, but what happens if that compound that works for TB happens to have possibly end up maybe down the road being a great diabetes drug that's worth $1 billion and we just lost it? Okay, that has never happened in the history of mankind, and it never will happen in the history of mankind. But yet, it's a potential, so let's not do something. It's easier to do nothing than it is to do something. I'm going to end with this one because I think it's as simple as this. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort to figure out how to get people to play well together in the same sandbox. A lot of it falls on vocabulary, historical perceptions, and everyone feeling that they bring value. Industry has done a pretty poor job of making academic research feel valued. Academic investigators have done a pretty poor job of recognizing the caliber and quality of science that's done in industry. We have to get over that. All the scientists that are working on something are working on it for the right reasons. They're all good scientists at what they do. They may not be good scientists at what each other does, but that's okay. That's what we want. We want to bring them all together, let them do what they do well, and then hopefully they'll succeed. Now, neglected diseases needs one more piece. This cannot be done in a for-profit setting. There's a gap. It's the same gap that exists for any disease area. Philanthropy oftentimes acts like a pharmaceutical company, right? MMV, which is mostly funded by Gates, is about running clinical trials. Pharmaceutical companies are experts at running clinical trials. If we can take the funds from philanthropy, the science from research, from academic research, and the process and ability to execute from the pharmaceutical industry, and actually figure out a way to put them all together, there is no reason these problems can't be solved. The problem that's in our way right now is a social issue of how to get those three groups to see where they bring the maximum value and actually put that pieces together. So it's an effort that myself, others have been fighting outside the walls of the BroadE, but your help in this area is greatly needed, and it's the only way we're going to solve this. I chose neglected diseases, but it's really the same issue. This gap is the same issue regardless of the disease space we're in. So I do ask that when you set up collaborations with folks, understand that there is a difference in perception and vocabulary, and try to work to build that team, because ultimately that's what's going to succeed. So I'm sorry we ran over a little bit, guys, but thank you for the attention. If there's questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes?
How do you achieve the cultural changes that would be required in order to facilitate this process?
Yeah, the cultural changes come in sort of a person-to-person dialogue. They start at two people, hopefully in leadership levels, have a dialogue, build up a trust, then it has to go from there. It can't be organization to organization, because when it's trust, it's about people. Yes, sir?
Maybe briefly sketch out on the academic side what you imagine as the ideal pipeline for finding a new compound and pushing it towards a pharmaceutical company.
No, I don't think there is an ideal. I think it's about scientists going where the science leads and continuing to push on the question of, will this bring value and what's wrong with it, versus trying to make it bring value. And so I think as long as scientists continue to drive where the science goes, it will lead to something great, versus trying to bring something forward or feed a pipeline or commoditize something too early. That almost always fails.
Part of the respect for the pharmaceutical industry is knowing where the line is where they can start to do a better job.
I don't think you're going to get there. I think that's the issue. I think there's a gap, and I think it's recognizing how far you can go and then finding ways of actually filling that gap. It's just too big of a divide to fill in all reality. One more.
I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on a different financial model for a drug development company.
Oh, yes.
So,
absolutely.
I mean, you mentioned like it needs to be for profit, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a public corporation.
That is correct.
Structured that way. So, I mean, I've heard the idea of like a cancer super fund.
Yep.
It wouldn't pay off for 30 years.
Yep.
It would pay off at 8%, and so they would have some flexibility.
Yep. So that's one model. So that's sort of the Andrew Lowe model. I think that is fantastic. It's around how do you, so even, and I've spoken to Andrew a few times, even if you, one, where does that fund come from? That's a lot of money. And then if it does, it doesn't fix the vocabulary, right? And so how do you actually execute on that, I think, is more important. I think you can take the general concept of bringing the best people together to win. And so one model that's a smaller version of that is there are a lot of for-profit companies in the drug discovery business that turn a profit and would love to have equity in a company that's making a drug. These are called CROs, contract research organizations. The way that they're typically treated right now is that a large pharma goes to them. They say, I will pay you for FTEs. You own nothing. Your people aren't on any of the patents, AKA we don't really respect you. Do our work, and we'll pay you. What's happened is that a lot of the drugs now that are going into the clinic were wholly generated by CROs through this model. And they're realizing that we got nothing out of it but FTE payments. So the day that the agreement stops, we have nothing else to do. So can you actually bring together these groups that have built up an expertise, allow them to own equity in this new organization, and then bringing, now the amount of cash you have to bring in is much smaller because they're putting in a lot of the work. It's all about sharing. It's finding what people want for their next step, what they're experts at, and making it all work for anyone. The issue is this. There is no one that I know of that is in a venture capital or pharmaceutical sector that would ever go to a CRO and say, you guys are fantastic. We love you. We'd like you to work on this, and we're going to give you 25% of it. Even though their value is actually more like 60% of it. They would never, ever do it. Culturally, it never has happened, and that cultural shift will have to change because these groups are able to deliver from beginning through phase 2, you have to piece them together, find the right ones, but that's another model. It's a shared risk model, but you have to share the risk, but give everyone something on the upside. And it's the giving someone something else that human nature is just working against us sometimes. One more, last one. Yes?
So we're talking about these shared models of collaboration between parties. Could you comment on a little bit about your experience within, like for the last 5 years, people are more recognize the model, see the value, have more collaborations, or have a different opinion on it?
It's starting to happen some, but it's on a really small scale. It's usually individual people, individual groups. Oftentimes, which is the case in many situations, these shared models come together out of necessity. Not because you really want to do it, but because you have no other way of doing your thing, they have no other way of doing something else. That's okay if it can prove to be successful for both groups. So what I'd say is that I think people are grappling with the idea. I think in general, this is an industry, as many, where secrecy and wholly owned aspects have driven success. And so now expecting an openness and not owning everything as a concept of driving revenues is going to be difficult. But I think on the small scale, this is beginning to happen. And there's one thing that the pharmaceutical industry does well, and that's mimic success. If you think about the experiment they did, they completely changed how to get safe molecules in, how to do it. If something proves to be successful, they will adopt it and apply it, but they're probably not going to lead the way. All right. Thank you, guys. Have a good day.